I'm Chen Zak Kane, the director of UNIDIR Middle East Weapon of Mass Destruction Project. The project has been a 4-year initiative funded by the EU. The objective is to conduct research, promote capacity building, and facilitate regional dialogue as related to the Middle East Weapon of Mass Destruction Free Zone. In this context, I really believe that the event today is directly advancing all these 4 objectives. When we think about how the zone can be materialized, one of the challenges is obviously the political ones. Many of them, which are very important, and we covered in various activities and publications, which you can read on our project website. The link of the website will be in the chat. I have no doubts that we will discuss many of those aspects in the discussion today. One of the topics that have not been fully discussed and explored sufficiently is how disarmament will take place in the region, not what is needed to get there, which has been covered extensively in our publication as well as others, but how to operationalize it. What will be considered by regional states and the international community as an acceptable process? Which models exist that regional states can build upon? How relevant are they? And what pitfalls regional states should avoid or lesson learned that they should consider? It is my pleasure today to introduce the paper authors, Ambassador Karim Haggag and Ms. Tomisha Bino. After both present a paper, we will have the opportunity to hear some reflections about the paper and the topic from my 2 esteemed colleagues, Ms. Gaukhar Mukhatzhanova and Dr. Hassan Elbahtimy. After which we will open the event for Q&A from our audience. You may use the Q&A tab or raise hands function to ask a question. With that, let me introduce our authors in the order they will speak today. Ms. Tomisha Bino was a researcher with UNIDIR Middle East Weapon of Mass Destruction Free Zone Project. She has previously worked at Kiel University and Chatham House. Tomisha, the floor is in yours. And then let me first actually introduce also Karim. Ambassador Karim Haggag is a professor of practice at School of Global Affairs, Public Policy, and the director of the Middle East Studies Center at the American University in Cairo. He has served as a career Egyptian diplomat for over 25 years. So with that, Tomisha and Karim, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chen, and hello, everyone. I'm really very pleased and honored that so many of you have decided to attend the launch of our paper. And with all the distinguished familiar names in the virtual room, I'm really looking forward to the constructive discussions that will surely follow the remarks by us, the authors, and our 2 distinguished discussants as well. As Chen mentioned, I was with UNIDIR, but recently moved into a new role. So I'm participating and speaking today in my personal capacity. And the views expressed are mine alone and do not necessarily reflect those of the UN Secretariat. So with that disclaimer out of the way, I thought it would be useful to say a little bit about why we wrote this report and why at this stage. What initially prompted Karim and I to write this report were the discussions within the conference on the establishment of a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. Specifically, whether the treaty should include a disarmament obligation in the body of the treaty, require NPT accession within a set time frame for signatories, or to have NPT accession and, of course, disarmament for a state that does possess nuclear weapons be a prerequisite for signature of the treaty. For those of you not familiar with the process, although I'm sure if you've found your way to this event, that probably is not the case, but just to be on the safe side. So the conference, which was mandated by the UN General Assembly in 2018, has held 3 sessions to date at UNHQ in New York, and will continue to be held annually until a treaty on the zone is elaborated. To date, Israel has not participated in the conference process, and out of the P5 who are invited as observers, the US has also not participated. So to go back to the discussions on the conference that prompted this paper, they were really centered on whether and how disarmament could or should be addressed in the treaty, but they have not yet reached a conclusion, and the states have not yet discussed how they might choose to address disarmament verification, how that would be conducted under whichever pathway they choose. For these reasons, we felt that it would be useful and timely to write this paper, which explores what each pathway for disarmament would look like, and what the implications would be for the negotiations and the implementation of the treaty. And I really feel that, you know, our paper does focus on this negotiation aspect, which perhaps wasn't really addressed previously, partly because, you know, there was no official process. Additionally, when it comes to establishing the zone, Israel's nuclear program and its disarmament, accession to the NPT, are really considered by many as the biggest challenges for the process. So we hope that through this paper, we've started to look at in some detail how a process leading to Israel's nuclear disarmament could look like within the zone treaty or for the zone treaty at such a time that Israel decides to do so. Let me say a little bit about how the paper is structured. So it considers two main pathways for nuclear disarmament for the zone context, either prior to joining the zone or through obligations created by the zone treaty. Under the second pathway, it also considers how the treaty could include disarmament obligations. So for example, would it require NPT accession, as I mentioned, so within a set time frame for signatories, or would it include a disarmament obligation written into the treaty, perhaps even with verification mechanisms or elimination protocols? The paper also then outlines the advantages and disadvantages of each pathway, both from the perspective of how much they would simplify or complicate negotiations, and also how they would be implemented in practice. Here, I'd also like to say the paper doesn't really go into a lot of technical detail on the process of nuclear disarmament verification, but it does highlight that, you know, a main question for states at this stage is what role the IAEA would have in nuclear disarmament verification. And this is a question that is open regardless of the pathway, especially given that there has only been one case of a state voluntarily dismantling its nuclear weapons program, that of South Africa. So the paper does this through a review and analysis of other relevant instruments such as the NPT and CWC, as well as draws on mine and Karim's own experience over the years with the Zone Initiative in general and conference proceedings in specific. And then after we sort of examine the different pathways, the paper then highlights three key considerations for states as they move forward in the negotiation of the Middle East Zone Treaty. The first of these considerations is what level of assurances, transparency, and information states would want to have about the nuclear disarmament verification process involving any state in the region. Again, as the conference is still at its early stages of discussing this topic, this created a main challenge for us when writing this paper, because at present, states have not fully communicated their positions on questions such as the level of information or transparency that they would consider sufficient regarding the process of nuclear disarmament verification in the region. So how much would they want to know about what was happening? Would a broad conclusion by the IAEA be sufficient? All of this is yet to be discussed. But that being said, and given the secrecy of Israel's program, past non-compliance cases in the region, concerns about nuclear programs in the region, and just in general, the level of mistrust, we felt that it would be a fair assumption that the assurances that states would require would be quite high. The second consideration is what is the expectation of states for the time frame for the negotiation of the treaty, how complex the drafting process might be, and what the time frame, their pain threshold for the time frame of the treaty's entry into force would be. And there are really no easy answers for this, because it's kind of a situation where you can't have all three. You can just have one or two, and then the third one will be complicated. So in the case of opting for a relatively easy negotiation and drafting pathway, that might seem like a good idea, but at the same time, that choice has to be taken with keeping into mind that it might delay entry into force if it is tied to Israel's NPT accession. Then again, a detailed disarmament plan might provide states with the assurances that they want, but would be a complex and long process, which would require active and sustained engagement and cooperation of several stakeholders, including the P5, as well as the disarming state. But on the other hand, it could also provide a serious and clearer plan and pathway for disarmament, which in turn could increase the credibility of the zone. And the final key consideration is the balance between these two considerations, like how complex is this drafting process to be, should be, would you like it to be, as well as what level of assurances do states need, and who will be providing these assurances. So I'll stop here to give Karim the floor. I'm sure he'll be able to add a lot more flavor. I really hope that many of you have had the chance to read the report, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tomisha, and thank you all for being here for this event. So pivoting off from what Tomisha presented, really the purpose of this paper is to present an overview of potential frameworks or models for nuclear disarmament within the context of the Zone Treaty, and also the option of excluding any nuclear disarmament framework from the treaty itself. So having disarmament taking place outside of the context of the Zone Treaty. So these are the two broad pathways we present. And of course, the challenge here when presenting an overview of models for nuclear disarmament is that there are few models to actually draw from. So in contrast to the various non-proliferation obligations that are incorporated into various treaty frameworks, including nuclear weapons-free zones, the frameworks that pertain to nuclear disarmament are relatively nascent and in many ways still evolving. That said, when we go through the overview of potential models in the first approach, that is incorporating nuclear disarmament obligations within the proposed Middle East WMD-Free Zone Treaty, we identify three broad approaches for incorporating these models. The first approach is incorporating disarmament obligations within the treaty, however, without a specific verification mechanism to oversee the implementation of these obligations. And here we point to two specific models, the NPT and the BWC, as potential models for this approach. The NPT, of course, bringing in an obligation for a state party to the Zone Treaty to accede to the NPT within a specific time frame, that would require the state party that possesses nuclear weapons to join the treaty within a specified time frame by the Middle East WMD-Free Zone Treaty. And that, of course, relies on the general provisions incorporated within the NPT that pertain to nuclear disarmament. But of course, those provisions pertain specifically to nuclear weapons states. And there are really no provisions within the NPT that pertain to nuclear disarmament for states other than the 5 nuclear weapon states identified by the treaty. The Biological Weapons Convention does contain clearer language regarding its members' obligations to destroy microbial and biological agents or toxins. That obligation is also time-bound, so the treaty states as soon as possible, but no later than 9 months after the entry into force of the treaty for that particular state. But the BWC, of course, does not include provisions for the verification of this obligation. So the BWC and the NPT really provide the anchors for the first approach of incorporating general disarmament obligations within the treaty, but without verification provisions. The second approach would rely on disarmament obligations with general verification requirements. And here we point specifically to the Treaty of Pelindaba, establishing the African Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So the Treaty of Pelindaba presents a very interesting case with respect to a nuclear weapons-free zone that is distinct from other nuclear weapons-free zones that do not actually incorporate a disarmament obligation. So Pelindaba is really the first and so far only nuclear weapons-free zone framework that actually includes specific nuclear disarmament obligations incorporated within the treaty. Because unlike the other nuclear weapons-free zones, which were primarily a response to perceived external nuclear interventions, the African Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone Treaty was seen as an instrument to assure against the emergence of nuclear threats from within the continent itself. So hence we have Article 6 of the treaty that requires a declaration of nuclear weapons possession, the dismantlement, destruction, or conversion of nuclear explosive devices and the facilities of their manufacturing. The other distinctive aspect of the treaty here, of course, is that it establishes a regional body for the implementation of the treaty in general, and that includes support for the disarmament elements of the treaty. So the African Commission on Nuclear Energy is the secretariat for the implementation of the treaty, and it has a role in nuclear disarmament verification in conjunction with the IAEA. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, of course, provides what is perhaps the most detailed framework with respect to nuclear disarmament. So the elements of that framework are a baseline declaration regarding nuclear weapon status, a template for steps pertaining to nuclear disarmament, so the removal of nuclear weapons from operational status, the destruction of these weapons, and all of this within a legally time-bound plan for the verifiable and irreversible elimination of their weapons. So introducing the element of irreversibility with respect to the nuclear disarmament process. And that plan has to be negotiated by the state in question with the competent international authority that would be designated by the state's party to the treaty responsible for nuclear verification. So there are two, in addition to these elements, the TPNW presents two interesting aspects with respect to nuclear disarmament. The first is that it allows for nuclear disarmament both prior to joining the treaty and also after accession to the treaty. So even if a state that possesses nuclear weapons is allowed to accede to the treaty before conducting the disarmament process, the treaty incorporates a very detailed framework for nuclear disarmament within the treaty itself. And then the other distinctive aspect, of course, is the role for the competent international authority with respect to the verification of nuclear weapons disarmament. So this is a function that the treaty gives to the competent international authority, and this would be complementary to and in conjunction with the role of the IAEA that focuses on nuclear material accountancy through the application of its safeguard provision. So the third model that states parties negotiating the zone treaty can resort to if they wish to incorporate a nuclear disarmament framework within the treaty is a disarmament framework with specific verification mechanisms. And here we point to the Chemical Weapons Convention as the model that can be looked to in this respect. So the CWC, of course, is thus far the only example of a multilateral disarmament treaty that includes a comprehensive disarmament verification regime. And the elements of that regime are based on provisions regarding the declaration, destruction, dismantlement, prohibition of chemical weapons and chemical weapons precursors. And these are embodied within the different articles of the treaty and enunciated in great detail in the various annexes to the treaty. And of course, the detailed verification provisions incorporated in the treaty and overseen by the OPCW. Now, we point to this model as one potential template for incorporating disarmament obligations with a verification mechanism. This may be too ambitious to apply to nuclear disarmament. So we have no nuclear weapons convention that exists similar to the CWC, but it is an interesting reference framework in terms of the level of detail and precision with respect to its disarmament obligations that we thought would be useful to include within the paper. So these three options anchor the first approach, incorporating a nuclear disarmament framework within the treaty. The alternative approach, of course, is to have nuclear disarmament as a prerequisite for joining the Middle East WMD-Free Zone Treaty. In other words, having disarmament conducted outside of the treaty framework itself. And here, of course, the precedent that we draw on in the paper to illustrate this approach is the precedent of South Africa's experience. The only case in which a state that had manufactured nuclear weapons, having voluntarily decided to dismantle its nuclear weapons program prior to its accession to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. And so, following South Africa's accession to the NPT in 1991, it declared its possession of nuclear weapons and, having conducted its disarmament process, brought in the IAEA to retroactively verify the disarmament process. Now, we go into some length in terms of highlighting the distinctive aspects of South Africa's disarmament because they are very illustrative of an interesting precedent that can be used as a template to envision potential disarmament, nuclear disarmament scenarios for the Middle East. South Africa's approach with respect to the IAEA was mostly cooperative, so it offered the agency free access anytime, anywhere. But essentially, the IAEA conducted the retroactive verification of a unilateral disarmament process undertaken by South Africa prior to its acceding to the NPT. So separate from the Treaty of Pelindaba, which did incorporate provisions for nuclear disarmament within the treaty framework itself, South Africa's nuclear disarmament was conducted essentially unilaterally outside the treaty framework of Pelindaba itself. So the point of this overview within these two broad pathways, incorporating nuclear disarmament within the treaty and having nuclear disarmament external to the treaty itself. The point of this broad overview is really to present the implications of each approach for the issue of nuclear disarmament within the context of the Middle East zone. So to recap what Tomisha mentioned, opting to establish the nuclear disarmament as a precondition for joining the zone treaty, for example, by requiring all states to be non-nuclear weapon states parties to the NPT prior to treaty accession, that does entail certain advantages. Of course, it obviates the need to incorporate detailed nuclear disarmament provisions within the zone treaty itself, thereby simplifying the negotiation process for the treaty, but also simplifying the actual implementation of the treaty itself. And therefore, states parties to the treaty would rely essentially on the IAEA to assess and gain assurance that all member states are free of nuclear weapons. And then finally, of course, with respect to this particular option, the excluding nuclear disarmament from the treaty would alleviate the very sensitive question of who conducts nuclear disarmament, right? So who actually physically conducts nuclear disarmament, whether it is the state in question unilaterally, or whether in conjunction with some form of cooperative agreement with the other five nuclear weapons states. And this is, of course, an issue of great sensitivity that the treaty framework would essentially avoid. Excluding disarmament completely from the zone framework, however, would effectively forfeit any ability on the part of the states parties to the treaty to influence the terms of the disarmament process itself. And this could potentially compromise confidence in the completeness of the disarmament process and therefore the integrity of the zone as a whole. And here again, just on a final note, to illustrate advantages and disadvantages of each option, we go back to the precedent of South Africa. So it took the IAEA essentially 8 years since South Africa concluded its additional protocol in 2002 to draw the conclusion that all nuclear material remained in peaceful activities. And as we mentioned in the paper, this was essentially the result of a very cooperative approach undertaken by South Africa with respect to its disarmament process as verified by the IAEA, allowing anytime, anywhere access, a full and complete declaration of its nuclear inventory with respect to its nuclear weapons and also fissile material stockpile. If we apply this template to envision potential disarmament scenarios in the Middle East, we can get a sense of the potential variations that might take place if a state that possesses nuclear weapons decides to disarm unilaterally outside the context of the Zone Treaty, whether that state is Israel or whether that state is a future proliferator that manages to actually succeed in acquiring nuclear weapons. So that process, if conducted unilaterally, in the absence of any specific terms or framework for disarmament, can potentially be based on incomplete declarations of its nuclear weapons stockpile, restricted access to the IAEA, to nuclear facilities and information pertaining to the nuclear program, thereby entailing significant gaps in the knowledge and the history and background of the program, no time-bound binding framework for nuclear disarmament that would be negotiated by the state in question with the member states of the zone. So all of these caveats might lead to a situation in which the state in question undertakes nuclear disarmament unilaterally in a way that compromises the integrity of the zone process and can potentially lead to concerns or doubts as to the completeness of the disarmament process itself. So with that, we wanted to present the negotiators of the Zone Treaty with a menu of options to choose from, highlighting the advantages and disadvantages of these various approaches. So let me stop there and then to you to open the floor for discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Tomisha and Karim, for really laying the ground for us for really thinking about, the two broad options and what the implication and advantages as well as disadvantages of each one of them line in front of the negotiators. So with that, I will briefly introduce our two discussants that had the opportunity to read the paper and will share some of their reflections. We will start with Ms. Gaukhar Mukhatzhanova. Gaukhar is the director of the International Organization, a Non-Proliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, and is currently based in Vienna, Austria, at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And if you're not following Gaukhar on Twitter, you're missing out. Not only does she share important insights during and on non-proliferation events, but also she injects her sharp humor into events that even in the most depressing situations. So you should. And then after following Gaukhar, we'll have Dr. Hassan Elbahtimy. Hassan is a senior lecturer at the War Studies Department and director of the Center for Science and Security Studies in King's College, London. It is a pleasure to have you both today. Thank you. And Gaukhar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chen, for this very kind introduction. I feel like I need to up my Twitter game now to live up to the description. And thank you very much to UNIDIR for having me in this event and for letting me read the paper in advance, which was being prepared. So I would start my comments with, first of all, commending the authors, Tomisha and Karim, for taking on what I think is one of the more difficult and sensitive aspects of the future WMD-free zone in the Middle East, both in terms of negotiations and implementation. As Tomisha said, this hasn't really been discussed very much in detail yet, partly because we haven't had the diplomatic process to do so, and partly because it is generally underexplored, underimplemented topic in the multilateral sphere. And so existing experience in the international treaties and regimes with regard to nuclear disarmament in particular is frankly of limited utility in terms of drawing lessons in and practices for the future zone. So the task was certainly difficult, and I think you did very well in terms of systematizing your approach to how to think about the elimination of nuclear weapons in the context of the zone, what could come first, and what kind of implications each approach has. So very well done. And just to comment, as I was asked to talk about sort of the international regime aspect of this, and maybe some of the lessons from the international regimes and treaties that you have used in your analysis. I like this idea of defining the two big approaches, so disarm first and then join, and then the other one, disarmament as part of the treaty, and then differentiating what kind of experiences you already have in the international sphere. And the broadly defined disarmament obligations under the NPT, being the foundational instrument of the international nuclear order, have, of course, for a long time been a subject of contention. Because of the lack of specifics in the treaty itself and the continuous debates in the review process in an attempt to define those specifics, to agree on concrete disarmament steps, and due to the general kind of lack of implementation. And so the experience of 50 years of the review process fighting over what is disarmament and how to implement it, I think is more than instructive for the Middle Eastern countries not to attempt to do the same with their zone that is just sort of prolonging and codifying the agony. BWC, I think, is interesting because it does expressly prohibit a class of weapons and mandates disarmament, but doesn't include any verification provisions. And for each of these treaties, it's important to understand in what context they were negotiated, why they went down the path that they did. And with BWC, the overwhelming, I think, desire was to establish a normative prohibition against an abhorrent type of weapon. The difficulty of coming up with an effective verification regime at that time, and the willingness of the US in particular to just go with it as long as they establish sort of this normative prohibition. Unfortunately, the experience of BWC is there was massive cheating on the treaty by the other key participant, the Soviet Union. And so again, that is a big strike against adopting that kind of approach for the zone, especially considering the history of distrust in the region. And so I think the zone would have much more concrete and practical issues to deal with beyond establishing a broad sort of normative prohibition the way BWC does. With the general disarmament verification model where you group Pelindaba and the TPNW, I think that's also very interesting to understand why those provisions are the way they are in those agreements. In Pelindaba, I'm afraid the provision for the disarmament and disarmament verification is more symbolic than practical. The key problem of South Africa and South Africa's nuclear weapons program had already been dealt with. And so the treaty establishes this requirement for disarmament and disarmament verification, tasking the IAEA and AFCON, one of which was not even in existence at the time. In a sense, it's lucky that provision was never tested because it asks the IAEA to verify the actual process of disarmament, which the IAEA has never done, and there is an argument to be made that it wouldn't do so in the future just because of the kind of the specifics of its work on nuclear material accountancy rather than involvement in any kind of arms control verification. The model contained in the TPNW is interesting and again instructive to understand why the Article 4 provisions are what they are. The emphasis again in the negotiation with TPNW was on establishing a normative prohibition. And therefore, states negotiating it were determined to conclude the treaty without and even against an active opposition of nuclear weapons possessors. And so that was the main reason that the treaty, while having a disarmament obligation, doesn't have specifics on how it should take place, within what kind of time limits, and who exactly should verify the process. So again, driven by the need to establish a norm and then facing the reality of not having the possessors, the key actors at the table in that regard, states were willing to sort of leave the specifics for future negotiations. How is that important for a potential zonal negotiation? Well, one of the key principles of negotiating a nuclear weapon-free zone, as reflected in a number of UN agreed texts, the key principle of negotiating a zonal treaty is to have all the relevant states at the table. And so the situation where you don't have a possessor at the table and you negotiate treaty provisions and leave specifics for the future, kind of kicking the can down the road, that may not really be an option in practical terms for the zonal negotiations. Or at the very least, it would be much harder to justify if you do have Israel at the table and is still believed to possess nuclear weapons, it would be much harder to justify leaving the specifics of disarmament and disarmament verification for some time down the future. So in that sense, I think while the TPNW presents an interesting model for join and then disarm, I think the specifics of negotiating a zone rather than a broad normative instrument really come into play here. The CWC is in a sense kind of an ideal example of the ones we have at our disposal in the international arena, where you, as Karim described, you have a treaty not only prohibiting a class of weapons, but also having pretty specific program for dismantlement of weapons. There are timelines involved and very robust verification regime. So that, of course, would be ideal for a zone if it is taking the approach to have disarmament as part of the zonal treaty. The difficulty there, I think, is the fact that CWC was negotiated with the participation of several key possessors. And so they all have, at least the United States, Soviet Union being the key actors there, they both had extensive chemical weapons arsenals. They could come to that negotiation of disarmament verification from the position of that practical experience of having developed those weapons and having them. In the case of nuclear disarmament under a zonal agreement, there being, inshallah, only one nuclear weapons possessor involved, you do need to involve external expertise. And so participation of extra-regional actors and weapons possessors becomes ever more important. The guideline for nuclear weapons zones is, yes, you need to consult nuclear weapon states one way or another, but the actual involvement of expertise in developing specific provisions would be that much more important and prominent in negotiations, even CWC style approach is taken. Briefly about the other major approach, so the disarm and join, I would note that the TPNW also has that kind of South Africa model incorporated into it. That's another option. You can disarm unilaterally and then join the treaty and then conclude an agreement with the IAEA to demonstrate that you don't have any undeclared nuclear materials and activities. So that seems like a fairly straightforward approach, and that was considered a simpler formula for the TPW verification, albeit potentially putting the entry into force or the involvement of key actors really, really far down the road. But again, I would like to remind some of the specifics of how this was negotiated and what happened in the negotiation. And so one lesson to draw from the TPNW negotiation for the zone potentially is to make sure that the stringent verification requirements apply to all states parties, so that they all have to demonstrate the absence of undeclared nuclear materials and activities on their territory. And then they'll have to decide whether that means comprehensive safeguards agreement and additional protocol, or something beyond that, that is something to be figured out with the IAEA, or with an addition of some kind of verification, regional authority, regional arrangement. But the key here is that if you are not incorporating disarmament and verification of disarmament in the process into the treaty, but only having it at the end, then that should apply equally to everyone. Because otherwise you might end up with uneven verification requirements for different parties joining the treaty, and that potentially is just not sustainable. And just to throw in a little bit of the left field idea, considering the complexity of all these conditions, whether to have, if you put the disarmament first and then joining in the end, do you make certain conclusions by the IAEA a prerequisite for joining the treaty, or is it something that you can attain while being a party to the treaty already? And here, what I think would be interesting to consider is the experience of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, of all the treaties. So they didn't deal with disarmament, but they have very elaborate entry into force provisions, one of which is that all states, all relevant states must bring into force their safeguards agreements with the IAEA. So we potentially can have something like that in the future zone, Middle East zone, as a requirement for entry into force, that all states either bring into force the relevant safeguards agreements with the IAEA, or they actually attain an IAEA broader conclusion, which is, of course, a very high kind of requirement, and then allow states to also unilaterally waive that entry into force requirement for themselves to kind of accelerate the implementation of the zone. I'll stop there, and thank you again very much for the paper.
Thank you, Gaukhar, and thank you for bringing yet another model that we did not take into account, but I think have really important lessons to be learned. Hassan.
Great, thank you so much. And it's first allow me to thank UNIDIR for the invitation and the opportunity to engage and read Tomisha and Karim's paper, and I hope they both don't mind me using their first names. I have to say first, Tomisha and Karim are very bold to write this paper. And the reason is we talk a lot about the zone in conferences, diplomatic events, and roundtables, but we hardly ever talk about what tangible shape and form the zone might take. And Tomisha and Karim both made that leap into actually talking about the substance of what that might look like. But also they addressed one sensitive and, in my view, really key integral part of what the zone is about, which is the disarmament element of the zone. So this is a zone that in the minds of a lot of countries or those who champion it, come directly linked with the uneven landscape in the region when it comes to nuclear weapons, and therefore any progress imagined in bringing that zone into reality would involve cracking disarmament, addressing disarmament head on. And I think also Tomisha and Karim both took that as the key focus of their paper. So that's why I really thank them for their daring attitude to sort of like delve into this domain. I really think it's a very good paper. It's an excellent charting exercise looking into two key pathways and a number of modalities and approaches that can be considered. So this is really a must read for anyone who's trying to, again, think or how that idea of a zone can be made tangible specifically within the disarmament domain. but also they go beyond that. And I was very pleased to see them reflecting on some of the factors that can inform some of the decisions linked to the zone designs. So specifically when they raise the points about, well, the tensions between transparency and thinking about costs and benefits of various options. And I think this is also a good way of opening up a conversation and discussion and more reflection on what actually some of these choices would entail, which actually also takes that conversation into a deeper level, which is very much needed, I think, to get that discussion moving forward. I think in general, I have 3 broad points to make. The first, I think it's very useful and very commendable to look into the various international experiences. I would add a caveat there that the vast majority of them do not work. I mean, currently we don't have anything that actually shouts at us and says, like, this is how you do disarmament, this is how you do it properly. We don't have that. So we might be limited when it comes to the value that international experience can give us. And that is because the international experience is limited, is context dependent, and therefore it can provide some guidance, can be an inspiration, but let's not be too constrained by it. I think it's very, very important to chart these options, to think about the pros and cons, to examine them, to think about the lessons learned. But I think to take that conversation forward and starting from this point that Tomisha and Karim produced, we think about what lessons can be learned, how can this enable more creative, imaginative, context-dependent thinking about how this can be applied to the region rather than be constrained by the international experiences there. So that's the first point I would say. The second point is I want to emphasize the importance of building a community of experts and building regional capacity that can take that discussion forward. And this comes mainly from my experience from 2007 when I took part in what was at the time a groundbreaking new idea of looking into how verification of disarmament can be done. And this was championed by the UK and Norway and the UK-Norway initiative, which was something very new and daring at the time. The whole initiative started without actually having a clear mission. And this is how sometimes things start, as in like we don't really have a mandate. There's no mandate. It started as sort of like governmental experts put together with participation from civil society to just like think through some of the verification options as something that had no prior international experience in. So it was really uncharted territory, and that's fine. That's sometimes how things start. But if I look now from 2007, I mean, that's quite some time ago now. One of the key benefits of this technical open exchange of ideas that is quite unlimited is that it builds a technical community that if you look around now when it comes to the IPNDV, International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification, group of governmental experts, all the efforts that, I mean, that discussion now has expanded significantly. But you look into how the Quad, and you look into how the kernel of that started from an initiative like this, that built a community that enabled itself to expand. And now we have a lot of experts that can examine and look into this and come with imaginative sort of like solutions to it. So I think this is something that maybe can be replicated regionally. And one way of looking forward, taking this conversation forward, is think about, well, how we can enable or foster a community like that regionally. That, to a large extent, will involve some technical input, really. You know, the people that you will call upon in order to implement these things when they come into reality. The third point that I want to raise in this context is the importance of enlarging the conversation around the zone, around nuclear disarmament as part of the zone, and around verification within disarmament within the zone. And when I say enlarge the conversation about that, we, for such a long period of time, this has been locked into diplomatic negotiations, multilateral conferences, multilateral diplomacy, which is all fine and good, but there is an opportunity to expand that, to bring, academia, to bring civil society, to bring experts, and this can give more energy, can give ideas, can also help us, perhaps look at the problems slightly differently, and can provide very valuable input into pushing the conversation around the zone forward. Specifically, this is very relevant when it comes to verification, when we're now talking about societal verification, when there is a lot of debate about how decentralized verification can become, and how the information sphere around us, defined widely, involves all sorts of streams of information that are not necessarily just controlled by governments, for example. And we need to think about how that features into verifying something like the zone, but more broadly, widening the stakeholders involved in that zone project. And I think that will enable it to become more real, more tangible, and will give it also maybe more fire and imagination. Thank you so much for the opportunity to comment on this excellent paper. And well done, Karim and Tomisha, for being so bold and daring, and putting yourselves out in terms of charting all these various interesting scenarios. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hassan, and thank you for suggesting both with regard to bottom-up, although government initiatives that grew up and developed, but also with regard to expanding the conversation and how you can bring both experts inside government as well as outside government to support that process and ideas how to go forward with that. So thank you for that. So we will now open the discussion for the audience and for their Q&A. If you want to ask a question, please use the raise hand and we will let you take the floor, or you can click also in the Q&A and put in the Q&A your question. I will start, as we start seeing more and more people asking their questions, I will in a second give the floor to them. But let me ask, I guess, the first question. I will take the prerogative and ask Tomisha and Karim one question. I know that it was not easy to write the paper. The topic is really complex and has many legal and technical implications that we didn't really cover in the paper, beyond the regional, the political, as well as the strategic realities. What do you think was the most interesting or important aspect that you learned while writing it? And were you any surprises that in your research that challenge your initial assumptions? So either Tomisha or Karim, you could take the floor if you would like to answer the question.
Since I started, I think we should, go in reverse order. So if you want to tackle this one, Karim, if not, I'm also happy to go first.
Thank you. Thank you, Chen. But let me just very quickly thank Gaukhar and Hassan for a set of what I thought were really insightful comments on the paper. So my appreciation. So Chen, to your question, I think what was really the most interesting aspect of writing this paper, it was a difficult, challenging paper to write. These issues are complex. So just reducing these different models and approaches to these two pathways, I think took a lot of thinking. And I really also want to thank Tomisha for her excellent work in framing these pathways and the background research that went into this paper. But I thought what was really the most interesting aspect was beginning to think about the various trade-offs that countries in the region have to confront, right? So asking questions, these questions that I think, as Hassan implied, have really not been asked previously, because sort of the zone for decades now was this sort of general sort of abstract concept that, as Hassan mentioned, was debated in diplomatic fora, conferences. But when you ask the very difficult, challenging question of, how do you do disarmament? Who does it? Under what terms? What are the potential scenarios or drawbacks of actually having states disarm unilaterally without any guiding framework for that disarmament process? So just thinking through questions that really have not been asked. So I thought that was a very revealing and challenging aspect of the paper. Just one very quick comment on something Gaukhar said, because I think it's very important. Gaukhar does a great service in providing the context by which these different frameworks and modalities were actually negotiated. And I think that is extremely important to bear in mind, because context is everything. One very important piece of context with respect to Pelindaba, as Gaukhar mentioned, she's absolutely correct. I mean, this was a novel, rudimentary framework for nuclear disarmament, incorporated in the treaty, but never tested. But I think also important is the impetus why the negotiators for Pelindaba did incorporate this approach, particularly with the regional body, AFCOM. And here it was very interesting in looking at the history, the negotiating history of the treaty, is that the negotiators wanted some form of regional ownership over the process, even if it was rudimentary, even if it was incomplete. And the specific impetus here was that they wanted some input into how the nuclear process would be conducted and overseen, simply because for decades they have been voicing concerns over South Africa's nuclear program, and nobody in the international community really engaged with or responded to those concerns, and that includes the IAEA, other members of the international community with a stake in nuclear disarmament. And so the impetus here was really a desire to have regional ownership over the process. So that's one important piece of the context that I think has a direct bearing on the Middle East, given that where the Middle East today seems to be in a situation similar to where Africa was at the time of the negotiation of Pelindaba. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, so for me, it was similar to what Karim had mentioned, and and also what Gaukhar mentioned about context matters. For me, the thing that I found most interesting in doing the research and thinking about the paper, because first the idea came and then the research for it, and just for a lot of us, we take these treaties when we're outside the UN, when we're researchers, and we think, oh my God, this is the best that states could come up with. But then when you read sort of like the preparatory work for the paper, you delve more into the context and the environment at that time, the different accounts by negotiators, you really understand how difficult a negotiation is. And although a lot of the people in the room, and I'm sure this also applies to the Middle Eastern states, we want the best treaty that will give the most assurances, the best outcome, and give everybody a piece of the pie. But at the same time, there's as Gaukhar mentioned, sort of racing to establish a norm, wanting to wrap this up quickly, concerns about will we be able to devise something really complex? So having to balance what is the best course of action with what is possible. For me was kind of the most, not to say challenging, but really interesting. And this also goes to something that Hassan mentioned. We talk about all these treaties and they're great examples, but some of them are facing, I wouldn't say not working, but facing some significant challenges. I also found that it was really interesting to debunk certain myths that that it's really simple. There's a lot of talk prior to the conference that this could be simple. We will just take a template from another nuclear weapon-free zone. There are so many examples out there. It's going to be mix and match, and we'll have this treaty, and this will be a straightforward process. But as we mentioned, context matters, and it isn't that straightforward. What worked for other places might not work for us, and also we can look at their experience and say these were the pitfalls that we should avoid. But I do believe, several people were surprised to hear that, it's not just the IAEA will establish the zone, IAEA will go in, disarm any possessor, and that will be it, and we'll all have CSA, and then and by we I mean sort of I don't know, I'm saying states will all have CSAs, and that will be the end of it. So yeah, just highlighting that important of negotiating room dynamics, what their pain threshold is for the course of the negotiation, and then the importance of that context, I believe, was the most interesting for me.
Thank you. I have many more questions, but I do want to give our audience to have the opportunity. So I will call our audience by the order that they showed up. So I have the first three ones are Jennifer Maccabi, Ayman Khalil, and Ambassador Sultanay. So Jennifer, if you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Chen, and thanks to the presenters for this great conversation. I put my question in the QA box rather than raising my hand, but I was just curious why you did not use the CTBT also as a model for verification, because it's got very extensive provisions and people are already discussing the possibility of applying it to the Middle East zone. It was just an idle question. Thank you.
Thank you. Tomisha and Karim, please.
Well, for me, I mean, it's pretty easy to answer the question. We did initially look at CTBT. We looked at other instruments as well, even bilateral instruments, to sort of, try to build this model. And this is the way that it, eventually, this is the final result. And yeah, it is an example of a treaty that has a very advanced, complex, robust verification mechanism. However, it did not have that disarmament element because, the CTBT is about testing. So that's why it kind of fell out of the scheme. But it was something that we looked at initially. So yeah, the absence of the disarmament obligation is the main reason.
Ayman.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And this is to follow up on Jennifer's question. And I think, yes, true, CTBT has a verification mechanism, which includes testing. But I believe that we can apply a transformational verification approach within the CTBT, meaning that the data which is obtained by CTBT could be easily used to verify disarmament. But on another note, I would like to congratulate the UNIDIR project. This is the first time as a participant. This is the first time I have access to names and faces of participants in a workshop. This is something which I have not enjoyed in earlier sessions. Aside from the brilliant paper which was presented today, I would like to share with you a concern. Because with all respect to the speakers, the discussion that we had today simply qualifies and could be classified under the umbrella of intellectual discussion. Now, this project is really unique, unprecedented. Unique because it has a very important international recognition. It enjoys United Nations umbrella. It enjoys EU umbrella. And with these assets and funds, of course, one can do a lot with a project like this, a massive project. Sticking to the intellectual discussion approach, and I know for sure that the UNIDIR project was able to get in touch and reach out to governments and officials in the Middle East. Yet the inability of this project to reach out and involve stakeholders, and I mean specifically official stakeholders from the United States and Israel, is not going to lead us to anywhere. Sticking to intellectual discussion is great, but more importantly, involving official stakeholders and important stakeholders when it comes to the zone is more important. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ayman. Thank you for the comments about our evolving online capabilities. We are managing finally to break into the virtual worlds and get more people to see each other as well as speak with each other. But with regard to the questions about officials, we have been involved, official, both Israelis and non-official Israelis, as well as Americans. And as you can see in the participants, there are also some of them are here with us today. Where we have real discussions is where we have the dialogues as well, but those dialogues as well as the workshops that we conducted for almost all publications are what informing the papers that we put up. So most of the papers that we have been publishing also actually went through a vetting process, both internally as well as externally by experts, international experts, as well as other regional experts. So both officials and non-officials. So thank you for that. And we will continue to really involve all countries in the region, both official as well, experts as well as non-official, because we are thinking it's important. And as Hassan mentioned, getting the outside voice sometimes of the non-officials is not as less important than the officials in the room. So with that, Ambassador Sultanay.
I want to salute all good friends and of course congratulate both the authors of the papers, my good friends. I have a couple of points and perhaps questions for further clarification. First of all, when you talk about CWC, it was worth to mention and highlight the fact that, of course, there is a deadline in the convention, 10 years. Of course, with the exceptional 5 years extension, which unfortunately both by Russia and US have violated, and they went beyond even 15 years. Which is a very dark, in fact, part of the history of CWC, which a precedence has been made. Therefore, we cannot even depend on it and say that that would be a good model. Let's assume the text as it is, the provision at least shows that there is a deadline. Therefore, one thing is important, the element of a specific deadline is essential for any future discussion also. Otherwise, we will have the same experience of decades like NPT, Article 6. Therefore, that is essential. We should not lose sight of this important one. The next point, of course, is when you talk about different treaties, of course, PwC, as it was clearly said, but it has to be highlighted that it doesn't have any verification mechanism. It doesn't have any system to work on practically. Because of the lack of any mechanism or international organizations or so, as it was my experience in Geneva after decades of the negotiation, unfortunately, because of the US opposition, we were very close to establishing one organization for verification mechanism, but everything is in dormant and it was total collapse. And it's unfortunate. Therefore, we don't have anything to say about PwC as an example. It doesn't have an example. It's total failure. For the, of course, the other one is TPNW. Of course, again, this is a pity that there is no deadline also there. It has, at least, it was expected somehow to explain rather than to say promptly or so, these kind of vague provisions. It should have specifically say, like a CWC, that this is expectation, of course, although it is not feasible. The other issue, which was, I think, eloquently mentioned, the lack of support and presence in negotiation by those possessors has, of course, given a negative message. But I wonder to what extent their presence was crucial for our technical specification that could be added value to the text. I don't know, because it is very clear for the experts, nuclear experts, they know exactly what we're talking about. We don't need a nuclear weapon experts to sit down there or diplomats to tell us and teach us what it's all about. Everybody knows about what we are aiming at and what has to be done. Of course, we have the experience of South Africa, as it was clearly explained there also. And of course, lack of any verification in the TPNW is a very serious weakness, which we should not lose sight. The issue, the experience of the Telatelco was mentioned. This is, I said it in other events of UNIDIR. We cannot compare this one because Brazil and Argentina didn't have and do not have a nuclear weapon. Therefore, this is no resemblance or similarity to Middle East that Israel has a nuclear weapon. Therefore, we cannot say, well, it was said that whether they should join first or next or so. Well, it isn't, as it was said, it was an intellectual discussion, it's good. But the reality on the ground, it is not the case that we can use it as an example. The next point, of course, is the question is, as it was said, and it is expected that the paper, as Dr. Ayman Khalil was talking about, with due respect, which is excellent paper, of course, they should go and highlight some realities on the ground. The reality is Israel has chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. And therefore, what Ambassador Karim said, okay, the possessor and those who are seeking in the future, we don't need this kind of hypothetical discussion. The fact is now, when let's assume that we want to see what to do tomorrow, is one possessor. And the other question, of course, they have not dealt with is which one first? Israel should give up biological first, chemical first, and then join those treaties and verification of OPCW or so, and then nuclear or all simultaneously. These are the real questions and practical questions that I suggest that it would be touched upon. It would be very helpful. But anyway, I commend both my friends, and I wish you all the best. And of course, we have to have further discussions, but I hope that we will have more practical additive to all what we have prepared. Thank you very much for anyway giving me the time.
Thank you, Ambassador Sultanay. I will give our both authors and discussion the opportunity to answer, and then I have a couple of more questions. I think Bassem will be first, but Karim, you want to answer first? Okay.
Sure, thank you. So first of all, thank you for all of the comments from the participants. I think this is a very interesting and rich discussion. Just very quickly, on this issue of sort of the intellectual aspect of this paper. So yeah, clearly this was, from an intellectual point of view, quite challenging because of the complexities, the details, and just the volume of information that we had to sift through to present these frameworks. But I really want to underscore that the impetus for this framework was really from a very practical point of view. So the practical challenge before states in the region is how do you actually design a framework for nuclear disarmament within the treaty, right? So the practical exercise that we are all concerned with is how do you actually structure and formulate the substance of a treaty framework for the zone. And so that was really the impetus, and hence the requirement to sort of go through these various options in order to actually present the negotiators with a menu of options to choose from to incorporate within the treaty if they choose to do so. One very quick comment on what was said about the CTBT. So in addition to Tomisha's response, I think that there's a lot in the paper that we don't address. So the focus of the paper was quite narrow on the issue of nuclear disarmament, right? The obligations that would be necessary to incorporate with respect to nuclear disarmament, the time frame, the modalities, and so on. But clearly, this issue of nuclear disarmament within the context of a treaty cannot be looked at in isolation. I think that is clear. There are a number of other nuclear-related provisions that have to be addressed in conjunction with nuclear disarmament that can reinforce whatever nuclear disarmament framework is incorporated within the treaty. So provisions on testing and verification of testing. What Gaukhar mentioned about the verification standard for nuclear-related obligations, whether those entail restrictions on fuel cycle, enrichment and processing, whether we need to incorporate a standard of irreversibility with respect to nuclear disarmament. So all of these related provisions, I think, form what we can call an ecosystem that would both enforce or reinforce nuclear disarmament, whatever nuclear disarmament provisions or framework is incorporated in the treaty, and give confidence to all states in the treaty that nuclear disarmament will be very difficult to reverse, and that deals with the problem, the associated problem of nuclear latency. So having residual nuclear capabilities that can give states the option to rearm in the future. So all of these, I think, elements need to be looked at holistically to reinforce one another. And that, of course, presents another set of very challenging questions that perhaps may be the subject for a different paper if Chen decides to bite on that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Tomisha, you want to answer as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to also, echo some of the things that Karim said about, this being an intellectual exercise. I suppose this is subjective because for me, somebody who's been on both sides of like practitioner and research, I don't see it as very intellectual, but, I let's say I humbly disagree, but, perhaps this is subjective. At the end of the day, also, it is not my place to tell states what to do. As Karim mentioned several times, this is a menu of options based on discussions that are ongoing or have been, discussions that have been had by states, that we thought, okay, this is a good opportunity to take all the things that have been mentioned and kind of break them down into their pieces, explain what would be good and what would be bad about each approach, what the implications might be, and how do these different options fit in the specific context of the Middle East. I just had two comments on something that Ambassador Sultania said. First, on the issue of WMDs, as Karim also mentioned, the focus is very narrow here. So it is nuclear modalities, nuclear disarmament modalities. That's why we don't go into the sequence. It is also my impression that nuclear is kind of the most urgent step for states currently negotiating, and I think that is clearly to be read in the reports of the conference, which also explains why we focused on it from the outset. And another thing is, yes, we do focus on the fact that there is one possessor and perhaps have left the door open for future cases of this. That being said, and this is something Gaukhar mentioned, which is very important, we don't want to have uneven obligations, or the states don't want to have uneven obligations. So whatever pathway is chosen, I think you can read this also in several reports of the conference, the treaty has to be equally implemented and non-discriminatory. So any thinking that we've done into how this could be formed has always taken into account that principle, that it will be non-discriminatory and will be implemented equally. Yeah. I have a couple points for Gaukhar and Hassan, but after, just on some of the things that they said, they were so good.
Sure. Thank you, Tomisha, for grounded us in the current negotiations and how that can fit into it or help them. Gaukhar, answer, and then I will give the floor to Bassem.
Thank you, Chen. Just very quickly, because the TPNW came up again, and the question of the participation of nuclear weapon states in the TPNW and the general question of necessity of nuclear weapons states and experts for these kinds of negotiations. So if the nuclear weapon possessive states participated in the TPNW conference, that would have been just a different treaty negotiation, like an utterly different treaty negotiation, I would say, specifically because if disarmament were to be included, then those states would have wanted the maximum level of specificity in terms of the timelines and verification, because they want that confidence in each other's elimination. And I think that standard should also apply to the zonal negotiations if they decide to have disarmament as a process incorporated into the treaty. So it would be, I think, I would imagine, the demand of those states in the region that don't have nuclear weapons to have the maximum level of confidence that the states that have or are believed to have nuclear weapons have actually dismantled them irreversibly and verifiably. And on the subject of the necessity of nuclear weapons expertise, the South African case, when you look at the papers examining the verification, you would see that even dealing with a post facto verification after the dismantlement, the IAEA found that the regular safeguards expertise was not enough, and they did have to turn to nuclear weapons experts. And again, that is the highest standard that I would imagine the states in the Middle East would also want to have for the verification of the treaty in the future. Thank you.
Hassan, wait for me, and I will. Bassem has been waiting very, very, very patiently. So, Bassem, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chen, and it's really good to see all those familiar faces. I actually had to step out of a meeting of the group of the governmental experts on nuclear disarmament verification, so the discussions have a lot of commonalities there. First of all, I have to express my sincere appreciation for Ambassador Haggag and Tomisha for this very insightful paper, which will definitely help and provide impetus for the ongoing discussions at the relevant UN conference. Needless to say, of course, my intervention today is totally in my personal capacity. But nevertheless, I wanted to express some remarks and reflections on the discussions that transpired today and some earlier discussions on this paper. And I also had the opportunity to briefly exchange some notes with Karim Haggag on this matter a couple of weeks ago. As I said, this discussion is necessary, it's important, and it's very timely. Nevertheless, I would strongly encourage everyone to fight the temptation to try to reinvent the wheel or overstate the complexities surrounding this matter. Sometimes when you're facing a complex problem, you need to go back to the basics and ask some basic questions. For example, is nuclear disarmament verification brand new? And I think you would share the view that it's not. We do have numerous successful examples of nuclear disarmament that has been conducted in a verifiable and irreversible manner. And the means and tools and methodologies that have been applied there, I think, are obvious to everyone. I think you would also agree with me that from a factual and technical point of view, any state without unrestricted access to fissile material will not have access to nuclear weapons, even if the non-nuclear components of that nuclear weapon program is there. Inserting the concept of nuclear latency there might take us all into a very difficult rabbit hole. Because the same concept is sometimes even applied when certain states discuss non-nuclear weapon states that are under comprehensive safeguards and even sometimes with an additional protocol. So again, sometimes it's important to note that we shouldn't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Having said that, I wanted to reflect a little bit on Tomisha's point that people thought that it will be just IAEA, CSA, and voila, it's and that this is oversimplifying this complex problem. I would beg to differ. I mean, getting a clean bill of health from the IAEA that declarations by a certain state of its fissile material and the relevant production facilities are under safeguards, and that the agency can confirm that they are not being used for any military purpose is not at all a simple exercise. But nevertheless, this clean bill of health is the core guarantee that states would ask for in a nuclear weapon free zone. Other elements of a nuclear weapon program, the non-nuclear components such as delivery vehicles and the metal components of a weapon, these can be subject to confidence building measures, for example, or transparency measures, but they cannot be verified. It's impossible to verify that by any technical account. So we need to make a distinction between what is verifiable and what is not verifiable in this regard. So again, thank you very much for this input. It will be taken into consideration by many experts that are involved in this process. Nevertheless, warnings, for example, that the possible treaty might have uneven obligations, or that it might end up as a non-proliferation treaty rather than a disarmament treaty. I think that the question here is somewhat misguided. Any nuclear weapon-free zone or WMD-free zone is by definition a comprehensive prohibition treaty. So, and that general prohibition, like what Karim Haggag alluded to, will be linked to an ecosystem within the treaty, something that will address the sequencing of the accession of a certain state, the sequencing of how that state joins the three main well-functioning treaties on chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, and then other provisions on the entry into force of that treaty. So, I mean, that misconception that warning negotiators that you might end up with a non-proliferation treaty that would grant Israel, for example, the status of a nuclear weapon state inside the Middle East, I think was a little bit something that was not really called for. I know that there has been some discussion on that, but nevertheless, I will leave it there. I will have to go back to that meeting that I left, and I look forward to future discussions on these very valuable elements with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bassem. Good luck with the GGE, and thank you for sharing a little bit different perspective. I think, let me give Hassan, I think, Hassan, this is for previous comments.
Yeah, if there is, if you want to go for like a hot pursuit for these points, or yeah, I'm happy to wait. It's on a different topic.
Yeah, so I will give Tomisha, Karim, and possibly Gaukhar also the opportunity to answer, and then we will conclude with you, Hassan, since we are already over the time. So
some
Tomisha.
quick things because I can see that we're running over time. In terms of, I believe this was a previous discussion, just to make it very clear for everybody in the audience and to reiterate for Bassem, we don't actually ask that question, whether it should be a non-proliferation treaty or a disarmament treaty. But as an insider, you know that this was something that was raised in different fora. That is not the question within this piece, however. On the question of complexity, I do believe that every negotiation is complex. It could be more complex, less complex. There are no easy negotiations that I have been at least exposed to. Is the process of NDV itself something that is technically feasible? Yes, I agree with that. How it will be incorporated into the negotiation, who will do it, as Gaukhar mentioned, what will the IAEA role be in this? That remains to be seen. On the question of CSA, I agree. A lot of states would see this as a clean bill of health is more than enough, and it is something that a lot of states have said that is enough for them. For others, perhaps not as much. And that's kind of the balance that or the different kind of positions that the paper is trying to account for. Some of which have not even spoken at all in the conference process. So just to kind of highlight those points, that the negotiation complexity is not about the technical aspects of the disarmament verification, but rather, how will this be incorporated? Who is going to do it? You also mentioned several cases. Perhaps we can speak about this separately. I was wondering if you meant actual destruction of stockpiles by nuclear weapon states, because the only other case where a state has voluntarily given up a complete arsenal was South Africa, which is why we mentioned it in the paper. But perhaps we've missed something crucial here, and I'm sure we'll run into each other, or you'll write to me, and I'd like to prick your brain about that a bit more. One last point, just back to Hassan, you know, see where we're again stuck here. Is this too diplomatic? Is this too intellectual? But you did mention, you know, building a community of experts, enlarging the conversation. As I'm sure you're aware, the conference does have a working committee connected to it that works intersessionally and that does invite experts. That doesn't mean that this is the be all end all. I'm sure there's a lot of opportunities within the region to, as you said, enlarge the conversation, have track 2, and this would be the perfect opportunity to do so, because it is my belief that, you know, track 2 has limited utility in the absence of a track 1. And now that we have a track 1, track 2 can really, same as what the impetus for our paper is, focus on the issues that are being discussed by the states and really dig deeper into them, have discussions, have recommendations. And I really hope somebody will take this up. Perhaps you can lead it, Hassan. I would be the first person to raise my hand and say I'd love to help with that. And we do have a lot of great people in the Middle East that would be so good at doing something like this and taking ownership of this process. And that's enough out of me for today.
Karim.
Thank you. Very quickly, because I want to hear Hassan's wrap up. So I fully concur with what Bassem mentioned, that there is no need to reinvent the wheel. And I don't think that's what we did in the paper. I mean, there were very few wheels to actually reinvent. So what we did was basically present an array of existing wheels that we have to draw on when it comes to nuclear weapons disarmament. I think Bassem is also definitely correct that there are some wheels that are easier to steer than others. So clearly, the wheel that focuses on NPT accession as the vehicle for disarmament is one option that we put there on the table for states to consider. That certainly has advantages. As I mentioned, it's simple. It relieves the negotiating process from the burden of dealing with all of these other wheels are certainly more complex. It does, though, have certain disadvantages. And this is perhaps where I would differ with Bassem. Not all disarmament frameworks or nuclear frameworks are equal. So not all nuclear weapons-free zones are equal. I think the negotiators for the Pelindaba Treaty would certainly take exception that the standard template for nuclear weapons-free zones are sufficient to guarantee nuclear disarmament. They clearly thought that they were insufficient, hence the need to incorporate at least the basic elements of a disarmament framework for Pelindaba. I think just finally, this opens up an interesting conceptual question, conceptual meaning that it is not divorced from reality. In fact, it's very much linked to reality. Conceptual question of how we conceive of nuclear disarmament. Is it a black and white process, right? So either a state has nuclear weapons or does not have nuclear weapons. I mean, that has been sort of the standard frame or template of thinking about nuclear weapons possession. You know, either exists or it does not exist. I think one of the very interesting aspects in producing the paper, Chen, to your point, your first question, is that you can actually conceive of disarmament scenarios within a gray zone in between both options. And this does deal to a certain extent with elements of irreversibility, but you can have situations of ambiguous nuclear disarmament, right? Of the nuclear disarmament taking place, but with certain questions or concerns that are raised on the part of member states with respect to the completeness of that process. But certainly I completely concur with Bassem that reinventing the wheel would be extremely difficult, but arraying the different wheels in the context of this paper is what we tried to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Karim. And Hassan, you will be our last wrap-up commentator.
Great, thank you so much. And once again, I would like to thank Karim and Tomisha. This has been a very rich discussion. This discussion that came at the back of what you've produced. So thanks. We'll have to go to you for triggering it all. Two final quick points. One is, I think we should not be defensive about intellectual engagement or conceptual dealing with this issue. We need more of that. There's not been enough of that. So I would encourage you and others sort of like to put their minds to it, and don't feel shy or defensive about it. I think that is something that we actually desperately need. I think the second point is one on the importance of thinking a bit also about long term. And so the CTBT was mentioned and made me think, like, the elaborate verification regime that was established and now in function as part of the CTBT, actually the seeds of that, were planted in the 70s, or maybe even earlier, but with the 70s specifically, with a mandate for a group of technical experts that look into sort of like seismic monitoring. And that is in the 70s, and look into 1996. So this is when it was called upon and needed. I mean, that group met without actually formal negotiating mandate or anything. There was no negotiations, tangible negotiations taking place at the time. But that just points to the importance of sometimes just like the importance of planting the seed and being hopeful and thinking about the future and working towards that. And I think that is also something that we need to incorporate in our thinking about the zone. Thanks so much again for this excellent paper and discussion as well.
Thank you, Hassan, and thank you for encouraging intellectual exercises as well as grounding them in reality and in practicality. So I would like with that to express my gratitude to our esteemed authors, both Karim and Tomisha, as well as our insightful discussant, Gaukhar and Hassan, and all our virtual audience for participating in this important and enlightened discussion. Thank you all, and I'm looking forward to see you in our future events. Goodbye.